people talk about, well, what's your true will? What is it, to do this or to do that? And at a certain level, it comes down to your preferences. But at a much deeper level, there's really only one way to the truth of yourself. It leads through darkness. It leads through this process of destruction and surrender. And if you survive it, it always leads to something deeper, something much more profound, something which is undeniable. And that's you.
Welcome to the Creativity and Consciousness Podcast, a space to explore the intersection of creativity, spirituality, and personal transformation. I'm your host, Jake Cobran, visionary artist, author, and your humble guide in the exploration of our consciousness. In each episode, we dive into ideas related to magic, visionary art, and alternative spirituality. I bring you conversations with leading thinkers and innovators to help us tap into our creative potential, expand our minds, and transform our lives. Whether you're an artist seeking inspiration, a spiritual seeker exploring new paths, or someone on a journey of self-discovery, this podcast is here to help unlock new possibilities and awaken our inner power. Let's journey beyond the ordinary. Welcome to the Creativity and Consciousness Podcast. Cool. So thanks for being here, James, or Entelecheia, as you are also known. I found your YouTube channel recently and really enjoyed it, and then also read your new ebook, which I also enjoyed. You bring a very lucid and clear perspective to Thelema, which I think is very much needed and appreciated as a way to kind of demystify it as a way of life and as a practice, and to make it practical and applicable for people's lives. And so I'm really happy that you're here.
I'm really happy to have the conversation with you, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think the subject I most wanted to speak to you about today was about the true will, because I think that is the central idea of Thelema. And I think that it also transcends Thelema in terms of if people choose to subscribe to the rituals or practices or read any Thelemic books or anything like that. It's an idea that I think is universal and relatable as we all navigate our own life's journeys. So I wanted to ask you first and foremost, what is your definition of true will, and how do you see that playing out within a person's life, as well as perhaps in your own life?
Well, it's a great question and a great place to start, because you're right that true will really is the heart and soul of Thelema, but a grasp or a full embodiment or incarnation of true will carries one not just beyond themselves, not just beyond Thelema, but potentially beyond this world and into other worlds. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about true will. True will is not something that we simply discover. There are discovery aspects of it, but it's a great deal more than that. The way that I think of true will at its root is that it's an occult power. And by that, I mean it is a force of the soul that we can come into contact with and we can unleash. And to unleash the true will is effectively to summon a spirit. It's effectively an act of profound conjuration. Not in the sense of conjuring something out of a grimoire. Not in the sense of invoking a god or a goddess. This is different. This is more like summoning the power hidden at the root of your own soul. And this is not a power that can be contained in any religious institution. I think that part is obvious. but it's also something that I think the entire spirit of humanity has to catch up to. It is a reality, it's a force, it is something larger and more immense than ourselves, which, when we fully become inhabited by, makes us more than human.
Have you read the book Power versus Force by David Hawkins, or are you aware of this book?
No, not at all. Tell me about it.
Okay. So David Hawkins, he's a kinesiologist, and he's a consciousness researcher. And he wrote a book called Power versus Force, which is, to me, in essence, sort of about the true will. But it's really about the ways in which we act from sort of small self and try to force things into coming to be rather than surrendering to a sort of greater power of sort of the capital S self of what is actually essentially in alignment with our true essence. And the book presents a lot of different sort of peer research studies on how adopting this as a frame of mind and as a practice can enhance one's life. But I think that there's something to that that relates as well to core ideas within Thelema and the idea of the true will, which is that the true will is not necessarily the desires or the whims of our small self or our conditioned mind or our attachments, but rather it's something that we need to be willing to accommodate and surrender to, that can often take us places that are even quite unpleasant or uncomfortable for our ego self in the short term, but are ultimately in alignment with our deeper purpose in life, and to fulfill whatever role we are destined to fulfill within the transpersonal narrative that's unfolding in our collective existence.
I think what you said a moment ago about surrender is key. One of the misconceptions about true will is that it's all about choice. And so you will occasionally hear people talk about, is it my true will to go to IHOP or Denny's for breakfast, or or something like that. And really, the true will is encountered and embodied in a moment of profound surrender. If you simply start from the perspective of surrender, it's just pure passivity. It doesn't go anywhere. And so, in order to get to your true will, in order to enter into it, in order to fully embody it, requires really the highest level of self-discipline imaginable. But the reason that it requires such a high level of discipline is because it requires the ability to know the precise moment of letting go, of surrendering, as you just said, to this higher power. And that is why, for Crowley, initiation is so much a part of living the life of true will.
So for you, the techniques and practices of Thelema, including the initiations of the OTO, for example, have helped prime you for surrender, because it can be quite difficult. Sometimes life kind of forces us to surrender in ways that we don't want to let go. Like, you get fired from your dream job or whatever it is, or you get the divorce, or your house burns down, or these kinds of things, which in a more elevated perspective could be seen as manifestations of the true will that are guiding us towards some other unforeseen calling or destiny. But in the moment, it can be very hard to surrender to these situations. So I'm curious for you, what techniques and practices have helped shift your perspective to prime your muscle of letting go, so to speak?
Yeah, it's such a great question because how do you plan precisely to let go? how do you how do you orchestrate complete surrender? You really can't. It's a paradox. And lots of spiritual traditions work with paradox and work with the unity of opposites. Thelema is unique in that it works with the opposition between control and surrender, between will and what Crowley refers to as passive love. In terms of sort of nuts and bolts practice, I think that often it ends up being different for different people. Crowley was very much in line with this thought that he would start from where the person was, what their predilections were, what their particular vices were, and work from there moving forward. So for me personally, I've always been, well, not always, as an adult, I have always been a very disciplined and very organized person. And so it was never that difficult for me to submit to a rigorous discipline of meditation or submit to a discipline of ritual. That was never really the challenge for me. So a lot of my early path probably looked like what it does for many of your listeners in terms of basic self-control and basic spiritual practice. The really interesting things start to happen after the first spiritual breakthroughs. That's when you start to operate in realms without a map. That is where it becomes more important to be able to structure yourself in spaces where there's no structure. When all of the other structures around you begin to crumble, when your meditation no longer delivers the results that it was in the first year, when all the fireworks and the lights from the rituals have died down and gone away, when you enter into those spaces of profound self-doubt, profound doubt about the spiritual path, that's when the real test of discipline starts, because that's when you're really turned over to yourself and you have to start to build your own structure and to start to build your own image that you're going to grow into. So the short answer is, it looked at the beginning very much like what it probably looked like for you and for many of your listeners, doing the traditional spiritual practices and self-discipline. But really, the profound tests come when all of those methods fail.
Yeah, let's walk it through a hypothetical scenario. So let's say somebody has already been familiar with the spiritual practice. Maybe they're even initiated onto a path. Maybe it's Thelema or Golden Dawn, or it's Tantra or some other kind of, high technology of consciousness. But then, the house that they had been saving up for the last 10 years burns down. And suddenly they're thrust into this really painful chapter of their lives where they have been uprooted from their security. How can the practice of Thelema and the different rituals and the orientation or perspective that Thelema can offer be a coagulating force or some kind of stabilizing force for somebody in that position to orient towards that event as an intervention, perhaps, of their true will?
So personally, I'm not a really big fan of looking at true will or spirituality that way. I think that we place a lot of weight onto the back of spirituality and expect it to take up a lot of the weight of our lives, and to be able to help us get through these difficulties with job loss or a relationship loss or some other calamity happening. The problem with looking at spirituality this way, and I'm not saying that spirituality can't serve some kind of purpose in this. Clearly, things like a spiritual community is extremely grounding and contributes enormously to psychological health. But there's a really big difference between saying that something contributes to psychological health versus it can solve problems in your life or offer solutions to them. I think that the most profound advances or kinds of growth that can happen through spirituality, they don't come about from solving a particular problem, whatever it may be. I think that the most profound transformations occur or involve a fundamental shift in reality so that a whole set of problems immediately disappears. And then 5 or 6 new doors open to their own sets of problems, mind you, right? But now problem creation at a much higher level. I think you see this in different spiritual traditions. Buddhism is a great example of this, where enlightenment in Buddhism involves a fundamental aspect shift on reality. A universal understanding of something like impermanence, for example, that doesn't necessarily help when your house burns down. It's still as problematic when it happens. However, the significance of it is then entirely different because your fundamental relationship to reality and yourself has shifted. I understand very well why people want to turn to spirituality in these profoundly difficult moments. I would caution people about putting too much weight onto spirituality at those moments, because I see the fundamental purpose of it as not necessarily to solve problems, but to change our entire relationship to what a problem can actually mean.
Yeah, I think I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I think Crowley wrote, I think it's in Liber O, the document about astral projection and hexagram rituals, something about not confusing the planes. So I think that what you're suggesting is that spiritual practice and these kinds of exalted spiritual perspectives or experiences exist in their own merit on their own plane, but like you still need to pay your taxes, you still need to figure out a way to feed your dog. You know, those things also exist on their own plane. And I think that a risk that people get into when they start messing around with magic or getting into these kinds of places is confusing where to invest their energy and what the result will be. Whereas there may be, like you're saying, that shift in perspective, which can reorient you towards an experience. But that experience that is unfolding in the world, like the material world, will have its own set of problems and conditions that are material or emotional and need to be dealt with, therefore, on that plane.
I think that's very well put, and I think that Crowley's advice about not confusing the planes is very well taken. The piece that I would add into it is that really what we can potentially affect with Thelema is not so much a solution to a problem, but rather a change in identity. And that's really where the thread of true will leads. It starts with this idea of purpose. Well, really, it starts with the idea of directed or intended action. That's really the basic sense of will, just in the normal sense of the term. You exert effort towards some goal, you exert some restraint on yourself. And then we talk about it in this larger sense of what's your purpose in life? And can having a sense of purpose in life allow you to endure hardship better? What tools does having that higher sense of purpose bring to the table for a human being? But I think there's a step beyond that, which we also have to be cognizant of. And that is the sense in which following that thread of will all the way back leads us to something far more profound and far deeper, and something that really challenges what we even think a human being is. And it's really about entering into that state that fundamentally shifts reality, and with it, what can count as a problem. But to get there, you have to walk through fire first.
So let's talk about that shift in identity. So what is the shift in identity that Thelema can provoke? And what are the means for shifting that identity? I know that Crowley himself used psychedelics and plant medicines to alter his consciousness. But even without employing the use of mind-altering substances to shift our perspective, how can the initiations and the rituals and the holy books and the practices of Thelema change one's perspective enough to radically reorient them towards reality? And what is that shift in identity that occurs?
It's a fantastic question. And the shift in identity, the content of it, I think ends up being somewhat different for every person. And I think even to some extent the path does as well, because really what we're talking about here is we're talking about initiation. Initiation in the true sense, not in the sense of having some people say some words over you in a temple while you're blindfolded, right? This is something that happens on an inner level. This is about stepping into the fire inside of yourself, the flame that burns in every heart of man and in the core of every star. It's about finding the threshold of your own soul and having the self-control and the discipline to walk into it without hesitation, and actually to let it destroy you. And what comes out on the other side of that? Crowley thought that alchemy provided an excellent metaphor for this process. He says that every material that you start with ends up revealing a different spirit. I forget the exact examples he uses, but if you were to use, a particular mineral, you would get a solar energy, or a particular flower, and you would get a Venusian spirit out of it from alchemy. And he says human beings are very much the same way. The symbol set of Thelema, and I include in this the practices, because the practices are really ways of interacting with the symbols through your body and through your mind and through your imagination. All of this is meant to orient you, to get you to make a turn. He calls it the animate version. And really what it's meant to do is to lead you into a kind of darkness. The path of true will, people talk about, well, what's your true will? What is it, to do this or to do that? And at a certain level, it comes down to your preferences. But at a much deeper level, there's really only one way to the truth of yourself. It leads through darkness. It leads through this process of destruction and surrender. And if you survive it, it always leads to something deeper, something much more profound, something which is undeniable. And that's you. And that's the really frightening part of it, is that you don't know, you can't know for sure when you're going through it, whether this is it or not. That's the part that really messes with your head. You can only tell in retrospect, usually. Crowley talks about this as well when he was going through the Magus initiation, that it only dawned on him after a certain point that he was going through these 70-day cycles. And suddenly everything that he was in took on a completely new significance. At the beginning of the path, it is fairly structured. You sit down, you do this many cycles of pranayama. You do these particular rituals. You say these particular words. But really what that's setting you up to do is to create a gateway. It's the only way I can really think to put it. The symbol itself becomes a gateway that you are able to walk into a reality which transcends the symbol. And that reality is really the bridal chamber of your own soul. Who are you going to meet in there? Crowley says nobody can say. Nobody knows the name of another man's god or the ritual by which they're invoked. So it is a radical step into the unknown at that point.
I think one of the core themes of Thelema that is so relevant to our world is this idea of individuality, that, as you said, no one knows the rites or rituals by which to call one man or another's god. It's the idea that we are all kind of the priest or priestess or hierophant of our own personal religion, and that our navigation through the realm of the soul is totally unique to each and every person. And life and the karma of each and every person is also completely distinct. And so life will present different initiations to different people that will allow them to uncover new perspectives through those particular experiences. And at the same time, there are practices or technologies, I guess you could say, that have proved to be effective through trial and repetition over a tradition, and that link people to a kind of history or lineage. But I think it is important to emphasize and for people to realize that you are always kind of inherently without a map. Like, even if you come to follow the most prescribed or structured practices of any particular spiritual tradition, still you bring your own unique nervous system, your own unique karma, and your own unique life proclivities and your own true will to that. And so it's going to be something totally distinct just for you.
I think that's definitely the case for the majority of people. Well, not for the majority. I would say for everybody. Everybody that I have met and spoken to who has had success on the spiritual path has gone through a period of extremely rigorous scripted practice. So meditating like their hair is on fire, or showing up and, doing the rituals and the pranayama and the practices with a almost machine-like devotion to it. And I think the reason that they I think the reason that there's such a high correlation between that kind of self-discipline and success is because all spiritual practices eventually become boring and even painful. And that's the point at which most people think that they know better what they should be doing than whoever the teacher happens to be at that point. And essentially what they're doing is they're surrendering too soon, where really this moment of exquisite surrender has to happen at a much, much higher level than people really appreciate. I don't know that it's necessarily the practices in and of themselves that make such a difference. We know that different kinds of meditation or different kinds of ritual or action can lead people to openings or realizations. I mean, personally, I'm agnostic about what the one right system is, if there even is such a thing. My practical advice to people is that you pick a tradition that you can fall in love with. You should fall in love with its symbols. You should fall in love with its liturgy. You should fall in love with its aesthetic as much as you can about it, for the very simple reason that that love and that devotion will make you submit to its practices and will carry you through the mind-numbingly boring and even painful parts of it. You'll be able to fall back on that at that point. And I think that that kind of devotion is very helpful for success. Of course, when you reach the top of the mountain or when you have the breakthrough, everything does look different at that point. There's no question. And I think at that point, that's when you realize that the spiritual path was not what you thought it was. And awakening or enlightenment is not what you thought it was. But that, without that illusion, without that delusion, you would never have arrived at it in the first place. So there's a complex relationship there, I think.
It's like that quintessential scene in Jodorowsky's Holy Mountain where they reach the mountaintop. It's the end of the spiritual search. And then he's like, pull back. It's all cameras. It's just a movie, you know?
Right.
And so it's kind of like the ultimate disillusionment of the ego is the renunciation of the spiritual goal in and of itself, like to kind of realize that the ground you were always standing on was the right place to be.
There can be an element of that to it. Certainly, that was my experience and the experience of many people I know, that it was actually quite humbling. Maybe even anticlimactic. On the other hand, you know, we have history shows that there are examples of people who were quite grandiose after their awakenings. The Buddha is actually a really great example of this. After his enlightenment, he returns to his fellow yogis, and I forget exactly how it's written, but they basically greet him as a friend and a companion as they used to. And he says, no, I am a fully realized one now. You'll refer to me as the entity that I now am, which is, I think, a level of ego that we're not used to associating with the Buddha or really with any enlightened figures. I think that it's very hard to tell, but certainly my own experiences have been quite humbling in their ways, and certainly the experiences of many people I know have been as well, that it's been a little more like Holy Mountain, like almost like some kind of joke has been played on you. That is that's an outcome that I can appreciate.
I mean, even Crowley himself was quite grandiose. One of my favorite Crowley documents is Liber John St. John, and I appreciate that work because it shows a really personal insight into just his plight and his quest, and it shows him as somebody who was a magus, but also was distinctly human and wrestled with the same kinds of challenges or doubts, and demonstrates also his intensity of longing, but that he wasn't always fully awakened. He was himself a seeker after truth, and he wrote very honestly and openly about what that experience was for him.
John St. John is one of the texts that I always recommend that people new to Thelema read for precisely the reason that you just stated, because it is a candid, unvarnished look at what actual spiritual practice and attainment is really like. He talks about in there about having his citron pressa and, eating oysters, and he's doing it right in the middle of a city, in fact, to prove a point that it can be done anywhere, even in Paris, I think he says. And he's seeing his mistress on the side as it's going on. But the really interesting thing is he also gives a description in there of, the actual attainment, the experience of the holy guardian angel and the impact that it has on him. So I think that whether you follow Crowley's teachings or not, I think he is, I don't know if useful is the right word. I think it's helpful to see what this looks like without the distance of history and without the distance of followers painting a rosy picture of a person. We have a particular understanding now of the Buddha or of Jesus Christ or other spiritual figures that's been very much clouded by history and by traditions that have lauded these people. Crowley simply left too much behind for that to be possible. We have his diaries. We have his own autobiography that he published. He was a prolific writer. And some people take from that an excuse not only to denounce Crowley, but to be lazy themselves. Well, Crowley was addicted to drugs, therefore I can sit on my ass and not do anything. They use another man's weakness. They use another man's struggle with weakness as an excuse for not struggling at all, which I think is a cop-out. But I think the flip side of it is that it's a story about a human being able to attain. And it's about a story of a human being able to be honest with us about who he was and what he went through. Yes, he's grandiose at times, but the human side also amply comes through as well. And I think that can potentially be quite empowering.
Let's just talk about Thelema in general as a kind of living tradition and as a form of spiritual practice. I think, in my experience, people are put off from Thelema due to a kind of distrust of Crowley himself, and that distrust kind of filters its way into the whole spiritual tradition. There's a lot of feeling that this is something fishy, or that the people that are involved have bad intentions, or that that it's manipulative, or that it's selfish. It gets a lot of projection of fear thrown onto it. And I'm curious if you have anything to share about that, to either acknowledge that as something true or to put people's minds at ease.
I don't believe that I have the power or the will or the desire to put people's minds at ease about pretty much anything at all. It's not really my forte. I think my energy kind of tends to go in the opposite direction. I think that, on the other hand, as a person who manages and runs an OTO local body, as somebody who deals with the public, it is very important to me that we model the best that a thelemic community can possibly model, that we set the highest standards. That's not a guarantee that people aren't going to think and say negative things about you. But it is a guarantee that you can go home every day with certainly a clear conscience and know that you showed up and embodied the best that Thelema has to offer. My attitude about it is that the symbol set of Thelema is a strong flavor. Even if you leave aside the personality of Crowley, and even if you leave aside this or that particular Thelemite who you heard did, whatever it is, whatever gossip people have heard, Thelema is a strong flavor. Baphomet, the serpent, a holy guardian angel, a guardian spirit that poisons you, that's compared with cancer, that's compared with acid, eating away at the soul. These are not meant to be comforting symbols. This is always going to draw somebody who is looking for a path toward truth that not only doesn't shy away from dissonance, but that turns squarely toward it, and which embraces it and is willing to walk forthrightly through it and to be cleansed and destroyed by it. I don't want to convince anybody to do that. I think it would be inappropriate. I think that Thelema is highly magnetic, just as Crowley himself was. I think the people that it is meant to attract, it's going to attract. They're going to see it. They're going to recognize it. They're going to be drawn toward it. They're going to move into it. And it's going to outright repulse a bunch of other people as well. I'm far more suspicious when people seem to be caught in the middle, when they seem to be on the fence about it. To me, that's more indicative of a fundamental misunderstanding. They're waiting to be convinced of something. And so something's going wrong there. Either Thelema is being presented to them in a way where it appears that there's a choice involved, or they're projecting something onto Thelema so that they think that they have a choice. But I think to fully understand Thelema is either to be drawn into its gravity and to be transformed by it, or to simply say like, no, this is absolutely nothing that I want to be a part of.
I guess it's like different genres of music or something like that. People will also, by accordance of their true will, have an inclination towards certain kinds of sounds more so than others. And I think that when it comes to whatever spiritual tradition and whatever symbols that spiritual tradition offers will resonate with people either more greatly or less greatly, depending on the character of the person.
Exactly. I would never be able to practice Hindu Tantra because there is nothing in the aesthetics or the outward appearance of Hindu Tantra that at all resonates with me whatsoever. I'm not outright repulsed by it. It doesn't have that particular effect on me, but there's just nothing about it that would get me to commit to it to the point where I would be transformed by it. Thelema's like that. All traditions are like that, I think. Thelema is different, I think, insofar as it appears to be particularly magnetized. It really does seem to draw people in or outright repulse them. Exactly. It really has the stamp of Crowley's personality on it that way. And as somebody who is in charge of running an OTO local body, my sole concern is amplifying the current. Basically creating as focused an experience of it as can possibly be created within a space, so that when people are coming in, when people are walking into this, they are walking into Thelema. And when they are walking away from it, they are walking away from Thelema. Either way, they're doing their true will, and that's what matters to me.
I also wanted to inquire more about what the OTO is and what goes on with it. To be explicit, I am initiated in AA, but I've barely ever been to OTO lodges. I've participated in a few Gnostic masses. I think that they're great, and I find that to be a powerful ritual. But I've never been a part of the OTO, and also where I live in Bali, I've never met another Thelemite here, and there are no OTO lodges or anything of the sort to be a part of. So I'm curious also, if somebody's in my position, how can they connect, I guess, other than the AA work, which is very personalized and solitary, to the Thelemic current and a community that relates to those perspectives and practices?
Yeah, so really the function of OTO was that it was supposed to be a vehicle for a revelation, for an apocalypse. The unveiling of the company of heaven, the divinity of the individual. And that revelation, that apocalypse, was never meant to just simply be beheld or to be contemplated. It was always about living inside that truth. So OTO was supposed to be a container for that, where people could experience that truth directly through ritual and through community. At its core, OTO contains a mystery. And there's an aspect of the mystery that can be studied. There's an aspect of the mystery that can be understood. But ultimately, much like the rest of Thelema, it's really a mystery that's meant to be survived. And that mystery, that revelation, cannot be contained in, well, it can't be contained in anything. To understand, to come into contact with the mystery explodes the individual. Certainly, it cannot be held in any institution. It can't be held in OTO. It's really something that, to even talk about an institution serving as a vehicle for it, it has to be, the vessel itself is going to be transformed. But I would say that OTO at its best is meant to provide for that encounter with that mystery which really lies at the heart of each of us. It's different from AA. AA approaches it through the symbol set of Thelema applied to individual work. It's an individual mystical path. OTO is doing it at the level of a community and a public cultic rite. But that doesn't make the fire at the center of it any less potent. It's still something that is encountered through a personal experience. And it's still something which, when embodied, is powerfully transformative. And really the best that OTO can do is to provide an access point to begin to experience that mystery or that profundity in the context of a community of practitioners.
And so that second question, if somebody is living maybe somewhere where there's not a local OTO body, other than solitary practice or through a system like AA, how can somebody connect to implementing Thelemic principles in their lives and connecting to the current of Thelema?
The best way to do that would be through contemplation of the holy texts, or through the set of rituals that Crowley devised that essentially created an embodied relationship with the truths of the Book of the Law. So, in my opinion, there's very little point in trying to work the system of OTO in isolation, because it is fundamentally a communal implementation of Thelemic principle. I think that if you were in a position of where you were just simply solitary and you wanted to begin to pull some of this energy, some of this current into your life, really what you have to do is it's all about forming an embodied relation with truth. So the truth of Thelema is embodied in several different ways. The primary way is really, I think, through the holy texts, through the Book of the Law. That's the crystallization of the speech of silence. And then you have other important texts such as Liber 65 or Liber 7 or Ararita. And sometimes people read these works looking to decode messages in them. They treat them like puzzles to be solved. You see the same problem in OTO with people trying to decode the Gnostic Mass or decode the Ninth Degree Secret or decode this, that, and the other thing. Nothing about Thelema is really meant to be decoded. Crowley was all too clear about what the meaning of many of the symbols was. Really, what you're looking to do through any kind of Thelemic practice, whether it's AA, OTO, or living on a hillside somewhere, is to develop a relationship with the symbols such that they become sacred to you. And insofar as they become sacred to you, they become doorways that you can walk through to find yourself. The symbols themselves serve as the gateways or the portals of initiation. So when I talk about the Gnostic Mass, for instance, to enter into a real relationship with the truth of the Gnostic Mass doesn't mean that you decode something from the Gnostic Mass, like that the lance is a penis or something like that. That's not the point of the Gnostic Mass. It's when you find yourself in the ritual. Well, it's the same thing in the case of something like the star ruby or the star sapphire or reguli. These rituals are describing a world. They're creating a microcosm of the universe wherever you happen to be. Whether that's on a mountaintop or in a garage somewhere or wherever it happens to be. And you're entering literally with your body into this universe. Not just through your mind, not just through your intellect. Your body and your soul are participating in it. And so it's really all about creating this microcosm, this symbolic set around you, and then being able to walk through the symbol, almost like when you're scrying a symbol, for instance. It's similar to that, except it's being done physically. You're doing it with your body as opposed to just with your imagination. And that admittedly takes some time to be able to do that, but it can be done. And so that's the advice that I would give to somebody. I would say, contemplate the holy texts, read very short passages on it, turn the passages over in your mind and recite them out loud. Get a sense of the movement of the words across your tongue, the feeling of it in your mouth, and turn it into a real visceral experience that pulls you in. And that's when you know that you're having success, because you're being pulled by a force of gravity beyond you through these symbols and finding yourself in an alternative reality. That's when you know that you're actually beginning to break through.
I like to see the holy texts as talismans. In a way, it was the state of consciousness that Crowley was in when he wrote them, and it's not just Crowley who wrote them, of course, but whatever consciousness that he was enabling to move through him, he was able to crystallize that into the text in such a way that it can be accessed through reading and contemplating them. So it's not, as you said, about trying to literally figure out what he was trying to say. It's more about the energy or the frequency that's emitted through the text.
I look at it that way. I also think of it as these texts or these rituals create a force field. And if you are able to enter into that force field, you have no choice but to be transformed. So it's the same thing whether you're doing the Star Ruby or whether you're contemplating one of the holy texts. These symbols have a charge in them, like a talismanic charge, like you just said. And to release that charge is really to create a space in which destruction and rebirth are inevitable. So that by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late.
I love that. Thank you. And I think as sort of like a closing question that I want to ask, is Thelema fun? You know, is there space for joy and pleasure within Thelema, or is it all just really heavy, intense, serious, austere stuff?
Thelema is tremendous fun. I think that Thelemic community is often a lot of fun, but I think that on an individual level, once you start to break through the first layers of bullshit that have crystallized and congealed around you, and you start to feel some of your own energy breaking through, and it starts to infect you, yeah, it's tremendous fun as you start to feel yourself and begin to express yourself on an authentic level. And there's a tremendous amount of giddiness in it. And I think that the moment of surrender that we were talking about a moment ago, I mean, the aftermath of it is like, it's like the afterglow of an orgasm. It can be quite intense leading up to it. It can have all of the seriousness of an affair, certainly, but there is no doubt that to break through is, well, I mean, the book of the law itself says that the nature of existence is pure joy. And as Crowley says in the Book of Lies, it's the giddiness of the release of orgasm. So yeah, that is ultimately, the symbol set is quite intense. Serpents and cancer and, sulfuric acid eating away at the soul and all of these super intense symbols. But I think it's important to keep in mind what's waiting on the other side. And the Book of the Law is clear about that. Existence is pure joy.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with the Thelemites I've known is that they tend to be pretty free and fun people. I think that it attracts people who are looking for a certain kind of quality of liberation. And also, I think that by immersing yourself within symbols that might produce discomfort, there's kind of an anti-fragility to being able to go into uncomfortable places or dark places and find a certain quality of equanimity or light within those places. So I think it can also help change somebody's attitude or approach to life, where they are more integrated and less afraid and more open to the polarities that exist in our worlds.
I think what you just said there about anti-fragility is very well taken. And I think that a lot of the energy that goes into fear when freed up can go into laughter and joy. I think that people sometimes approach Thelema as if it just at the outset that it's a joke, that it's kind of a fake religion, and that it is something that, it's they just basically take the message to be just surrender from the outset. It's about drinking and drugs and lots of sex with no rules. And I think that the disciplined side of it, the will side of it, ironically enough, is lost. And so I think it's a helpful corrective to put some of that at the front. But I think that the purpose of it, well, not the purpose, but certainly one of the outcomes of it, is that it's about elevating instinct and pleasure to a much higher level than it's ordinarily able to operate at. There's a certain level of instinct that only gets unleashed when it is placed at the pinnacle of a high degree of self-control. It's really about experiencing vice at such a level that it actually becomes an expression of something much higher than you would normally take it to be. And the same thing goes with humor as well, and all other forms of spontaneous release.
So just to elaborate on that a little bit, what are some of the basic practices? Because I do assume there's going to be some people listening to this that have no experience base or knowledge around Thelema, although probably some listening to it will also be fairly advanced in that practice. But what are some of the basic practices or techniques to achieve self-mastery, self-discipline, and self-control within Thelema?
So most of the practices of self-control in Thelema, the sort of preliminary practices, if you will, are the same practices that you would find not only in other spiritual traditions, but in a lot of self-help. So O.T. Crowley designed the first set of degrees of OTO to basically instill these in people. And they're basically what you would expect. So you don't want to be controlled by things outside of you, and you don't want to be controlled by people outside of you. You want to start to shift the locus of control inwardly. So if you have dependence upon food, alcohol, drugs, those are things that you're going to have to get a hold on in any spiritual tradition. Other spiritual traditions will outlaw them outright. Thelema doesn't, but it says that you have to have a disciplined relationship to them. Some people will say, well, it's my will to, indulge in all of these drugs. And you're going to get the version of will out of that, which is about as, I think, shallow as you get going into it. If that's as much will as you want, that's as much will as you're going to get. But if you want to get to these deeper levels of self-possession and going through the initiatory fire that we talked about, you have to take it to a much higher degree than that. When it comes to other people, it's the same thing. I think that Crowley underappreciated the importance of relationships to other people.
Absolutely.
I tend to bring it more to the forefront in my own work, because I think that solid relationships with other people are a very powerful resource for exploration of yourself and for the world, because you have something to fall back on to help you recharge and to resource you. And so you can penetrate more deeply into reality when you're resourced by other people. But you don't want to get into what we would call, codependent or enmeshed relationships. And that is continually a problem in any community, thelemic or otherwise. So I would say at its most basic level, you're really not dealing with anything that's thelemic per se. It's just the normal things that anybody would have to do in order to, get their shit together. I think that the next level after that, and they don't have to necessarily go in sequence, but I think of them this way in terms of, I think of them in terms of a sort of hierarchy, would be then you're talking about doing practices such as Star Ruby, Star Sapphire, Reguli, Mass of the Phoenix, things of that nature, which my understanding of them is that the primary purpose of these practices is to build that relationship with the symbol set that we were talking about so that they can ultimately serve as gateways or talismans, as you were putting it, to affect a connection with this transformative energy. That's its own kind of discipline, because you have to show up every day to do the meditation or to do the ritual or to contemplate the passage from the Holy Book, to build that relationship over time. To build a relationship with a symbol set isn't terribly different from building a relationship with a person. It takes time, in the sense that you start to eventually encounter another world through another person that you have a close relationship with. So too do you begin to develop a relationship with the magical universe through the relationships that you build with these symbols. So those are really the first two basic levels of structuring that happen in Thelema. There's the sort of preliminary, I call it the preliminary or basic ethical practices, which is, basic practices of self-possession and self-direction that you encounter, that you need for almost any kind of mastery. And then that building that structured relationship with the symbol set to begin to affect a deep relationship with the magical universe, which lies beyond those symbols.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also like framing it that way. I think the work of Malkuth, sort of the first stage of the journey, is about getting your shit together ultimately before you're able to get into deeper spiritual work, which requires a certain degree of stability, or at least it helps to have that certain degree of stability within your life and your resources and your relationships and your home and finances and things like this. And I agree also, I think it was one of Crowley's main shortcomings was his poor relationship skills. He's certainly not somebody that I would idolize when it comes to being good at building and maintaining relationships, although he was certainly good at influencing people, which is interesting considering that he's a Libra sun and has a lot of Libra placements, which usually bodes well for diplomacy and fairness and consideration of others. But he kind of continually burnt bridges throughout his life in ways that he wasn't very good at maintaining relationships in a harmonious way.
I would say that the lesson to take from Crowley, one of the important lessons to take from Crowley, is that you don't have to be some kind of perfected being in order to have spiritual attainment. I would not go the extra step and say, therefore, you should emulate Crowley. and basically not, and purposely be off-putting to people or not have things like money and relationships in order. I think it really underlines the difference between these two kinds of work. This goes back to something that we were talking about earlier, right? The force that causes your house to burn down is not the force that causes you to become enlightened or to have an understanding of, universal impermanence or something. It really is two different skill sets, and you are ultimately going to get what you optimize for.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. If you have any kind of final thoughts, or if there's a burning pearl of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners before we go, I would appreciate that. And if not, if you can just let us know where people can find you and interact more with your work, or if you have anything you'd like to promote or share.
Sure. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. If I had to convey any final thoughts, it would be that the purpose of my work is not really to teach or to lecture, nor is it really about gathering followers. It's about serving a process which I see as already underway, and larger than us. It is a power that has the ability to initiate us in the true sense of the word and liberate us. And it's not something you sign up for, although I do have a mailing list if you'd like to sign up for it and keep up with what's going on with me. But it's something more than that. And if you are interested in walking the same path with me and going through these transformations and seeing what happens with it, then I'm here for that. Please reach out, and you can find me through my website, lapismercurii.org, lapis-mercurii.org. I'm famous for using names that are hard to spell and pronounce, and but I will trust that you will include that in the show notes.
Great. Well, thanks again, James, and thanks to everybody who's listened.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the podcast. I am the DFT Elf. Let's take you into your dimension. New episodes of the Creativity and Consciousness podcast dropping soon. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to stay connected and join a like-minded community, hop in the Telegram group where we discuss the latest episodes and ideas they spark. Sending you instant love and gratitude for being part of this journey.